But we still had results, and it was still meaningful.
Yeah.
It just wasn't what we were expecting.
This is also where collaboration really helps, because you don't really want to get too far down a path that isn't going anywhere. And as much as you know, if you're working with another person, they know twice as much. So you can make some good judgments about what are fruitful, promising areas to look at, and what maybe has been done and tried and really doesn't go anywhere.
And also be looking at your data from the very beginning, be immersed in it. And I know people who would just collect all their data and then go back and look and see what they had. Mm-hmm. Well, you might have had a problem day one and just not realize it, you know, so you got to be on top of it, be looking and sifting through it as you go and make sure, is this going where I think I am? Do I need to change things?
Yeah, and you have to be flexible. You can't get locked into a hypothesis and be committed that this is the only thing that I'm willing to find. You have to be flexible with what the data actually are telling you.
That's what actually makes what you're doing so fun and exciting. One of the biggest differences between a master's thesis and a PhD dissertation is that for a master's thesis, a lot of times the professor pretty much knows kind of where they're going. They pretty much have their arms wrapped around the project. You know, there might be a few things they're not certain about. But for a PhD dissertation, you don't know. And to your point, you could absolutely end up with a completely different conclusion, and that is by definition success in my mind if you sell it right. But that's what makes your research so exciting, because you don't know where you're going. That's the definition of research. And when you do find that really exciting truth, you want to tell the whole world about it. So you're in a great place. This is what, you know, it just keeps me up at night thinking about my research.
So I have a question about data. So if you run an experiment and this experiment has given you some results, and you realize that these results, they point to different things. For example, you run an experiment and one result point to a different direction. Mm-hmm. Another result could be used to justify a different hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Could you then use this same experiment but submit 2 or 3 different conference papers or journal papers with those different results but on the same experiment, obviously with different literature reviews as well?
If you're
you got to be careful.
You have to be careful. But if you are telling a different story, if there's new information, and if the problem is that when you have 2 papers and you're submitting them simultaneously, you can't reference them because they're not published. So to Professor Smith's point, yeah, you have to be careful. It's possible, but is it new information? Are they sufficiently distinct pieces of work?
So, for example, let me give you an example. Say I run an experiment. I'm talking about trust management in vehicle networks, okay? And in this experiment, I'm using 2 performance metrics, okay? For example, one is to look at congestion in vehicles. One is to look at detection of malicious nodes. And the other probably gives me results about collision avoidance, okay? Mm-hmm. Could I write 3 different papers, one on collision avoidance, one on malicious node detection, one on congestion control, on this same experiment, but obviously for each one I look at literature review for congestion control separately, I look at literature review for malicious node detection separately, I use different mathematical models, but...
Okay, the first one that you work on is your primary experiment. The other 2 are called secondary data analysis, because you are analyzing data that came out of one focus for another purpose. And it's perfectly legitimate to do secondary data analysis on existing data. Where you run into problems is if you make a claim that this experiment was about this, and then here this experiment was about this, and then here this experiment was about this. It's all the same data. And then you run into problems. So you really have to re-articulate what the purpose of the study is from the primary data collection to the secondary findings that you're getting out of it.
Let me throw out this one question. It's kind of an open question. One of the things that they will look at, they being the tenure review committee, is when you write your papers, how many people actually cited it? You know, it's meaningful if you write your paper and 400 people cited your paper and they said that's very meaningful compared to someone no one cited it. So the question is, and it's kind of an open question, would it be ethical of me, who I'm writing this paper on metal forming, but my colleague, I know this colleague very well, he's also an assistant professor, he's at U of D, and I say, hey, when you write your paper, can you remember me? Make sure you kind of throw in a reference to me. Is that ethical? I mean, it's an open question, and I think there's some gray area there. And it speaks to this cartoon. There's some gray area, and it's sometimes really easy to get yourself in trouble. So, next slide. Different, some journals
This
are...
is about that open access piece that you were
Yeah.
talking about.
Go ahead. Yeah, it's really you're under pressure, and they're going to look at your journals, and if you have 65 journal publications, and by the way, when I say journal, also there could be other publications in something called conference proceedings. I think you guys are familiar with that. But every journal has a different way of evaluating your work, and sometimes it's tempting to just say, you know what, I just have to get these things published. I'm going to the journal for which I know that they really don't carefully look at it. And I'll be honest with you, I think as an assistant professor, I think I fell to that criticism a little bit on some of my papers. I was under a rush. I was like, I've got like a year and a half left before they review this. I do not have 8 months to go back and forth. Okay, even though that probably would have made my paper a lot better by improving it. You get the review, you improve it. I know it's going to get published, go. There's gray area in that. But I mean, here, it's something you have to think about because they will look at the quality of the journal.
And that's something really important to think about is quantity versus quality of publications. That's important. And as the publishing process continues to change, there are more and more outlets available. Many of those are relatively poor quality. Some of the open access, there's some wonderful open access journals. There are also some really absolutely horrible open access journals. So just pay attention to the quality. And there are some good quality metrics, things like impact factor of journals. It's not an ideal indicator of quality, but it's certainly very helpful.
Next slide. Just filling you in on the culture. Okay, it's a reality. You're going to be evaluated by your peers. The professor who sits right next to you, the office down the hallway. It's just an FYI. I don't know if you guys have any insightful remarks for that. I just had to put that on there because the professors serve on committees. Full professors typically will be, sometimes associate professors, actually professors, associate professor, on the tenure review committees. But having good relationships with your colleagues is very important. Making sure that they understand the value of your work is really, really important. So it goes back to salesmanship.
Yeah, you don't actually have the capacity to be good friends with all the people on your tenure review committee, though. So what you actually need is somebody who will be your champion. And they don't talk much about mentoring as an assistant professor, but as an assistant professor, you need someone who's got your back, who's going to be your mentor, who will be on that committee that will make the argument for you if things start to go south. And it's absolutely critical that you have this relationship built from the very first year. You can't develop it when you're going in for tenure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you really think about it, your career is being shaped in part by 3, 4 other, depending on how big the school. Just a small handful of professors. And they're looking at your CV. We'll talk about the CV in a little bit. So.
And they're moody and they're grumpy and they don't necessarily pay attention. So you need someone who's on your side, who's looked at your materials, knows what you've done, and can make the argument because you're not in that room.
Let me give you some examples of what some of the conversations that could take place. Well, this professor has 55 journal publications going into their tenure review. However, one of the things you have to put down is how much did you contribute to that publication? 10%, 80%? So you typically have to put that down. And so they might look at it and say they've got 55 publications, journals, but it was 10% all the way. Or they were the third author. Perhaps their student was the first one, so they're actually trying to help their student, but they don't see that. Another thing is your money that you bring in. You see, you can bring in money. You write a proposal as a co-PI or a PI. Okay, that's a principal investigator. So it's very meaningful to be a PI for the money that you bring in, and they will divide that. They'll look at it. Oh, this person brought in $350,000, but $20,000 of that was associated with the PI work. All the rest, they were just working with this professor, that professor. They will pick those CVs apart. Absolutely pick them apart.
And you can also understand every department has different expectations.
Yeah.
And even where I came from, the faculty members, even the assistant faculty members, it was just as valued if you were last in corresponding author as if you were first, because it meant you were developing a student and that you're the advisor. So the first author was the student writing it. The last author was the advisor who was guiding this research, who might have helped with the ideas and guided it. And the people in the middle, not doing much, right? But my impression here is that an assistant professor, I better have at least as many first author publications. Okay, so that's something different. And I didn't know that before talking to people. And it might be different in our department than in other departments. So.
And I'll say this, and this is unfortunate, it's a moving target.
Yeah.
It's a moving target. If you have a different dean or a different, they have a different personality, so it's a reality. Sometimes the target is moving.
But the good side of it is, this goes back to the salesmanship again. You're making your case for tenure. You have to make the case about, for example, for me, I have 65 pieces in which I am either second or third author in publication, because I'm a statistician. That's what I do. I come into projects, I help people, I develop their statistical analyses, and I write up the results section for them, and they framed everything else. So I had to make the case that that's part of what my research proficiency was when I was putting my tenure file together. That yes, I'm in a lot of the one-down position, but it's part of what my research is. So on one level, there's the evidence, but on another level, it's what you say about that evidence and what it says about who you are as a researcher and as a teacher.
Question in the back?
In the review committee, does the committee look at the student reviews for the professor throughout the last 10 years?
Yep.
Yep. They will look at it. All the student selected, your sampling of the student reviews, also the reviews on your committee performance. So you served on some, general education review committee. They will go to the chair and say, "Oh, okay, how did this person perform?" Write a short paragraph on how they perform.
Right. And at the end of this, I'm going to ask Lorenzo to write me a letter so I can put it in my file and
There you
go up
go.
for a
That's something I did not realize, that you need proof of everything.
Yeah,
You got to start the day you start your job, just keeping letters of everything that you participated in, every paper you've written, every grant proposal, whether it got funded or not. And the other thing when you said quantity versus quality, with grant proposals too. You can submit 1 or 2 really good proposals and have a better chance than if you spend your year writing 12 proposals.
Right.
Yeah.
You just don't have the time for that.
Yeah. These proposals are, if you write a proposal to NIH or an NSF, this is like 4-month process or more.
Yeah.
It's not a weekend thing. I will say this though, as you mature, a lot of times, and I found this for me, early on I had spent a whole lot of time writing proposals, but after a while the proposals almost would fall in my lap. And I have these relationships with people in industry, and they almost come to me and say, "Lorenzo, we have $80,000. We want you to do this. Can you just take this and kind of write a proposal around it?" Sure. So so it does get easy as you develop those relationships.
Right. That also means that anytime somebody asks you, "Well, what can I do in return? What can I do for you?" The answer is, write me a letter and copy the dean, so that the dean has a copy of all of these lovely letters about you. For some reason, when I'm on tenure committees, paper means more than email. I think there's this kind of vague concern that email is being forged somehow.
Who knows? One thing that I really think is it's just kind of a tip. Most of the time, you will have to prepare an activity report, okay, at the end of, annually. And man, I wish I would have done this, but just be organized. I mean, every time something happens, you serve on a committee, open up that Word file, type it in. It can be sloppy, but type it in. Every time you get a new paper published, type it in. Every time, use that template and update it constantly, because you don't want to be. And I've done this. I lost track of how many years. 1 week to go. I got to get this activity report in, and I'm just scrambling, going through my emails and trying to figure out what I did. So just a side tip.
And the activity reports are really a good idea because
Yeah.
one of the things that happens is, as a new faculty member, there are all sorts of holes on your time. And so it's really easy to lose track of time by prepping new courses, by doing extra service obligations, and then other things start to slip through the cracks. And so a year can go by and you quickly realize that you haven't gotten nearly as much done as you wanted to do. So keeping track is really, really difficult.
Okay, next slide. Let's talk about teaching. Okay, so we talked a little bit about research. Actually, we talked about teaching too, but let's talk a little bit more about teaching. Again, this balancing act. All right, so next slide. Read it. Young professors may find that teaching is not as easy as it may appear. Dr. Conrad talked about that. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's work. If you really care about the students, it's not easy because you have students who have different abilities, different constraints. Some students really, really care and they're trying hard, but you know what? They have to babysit their 3 younger brothers and sisters because there's a lot of constraints that a professor has to go through, under which you have to teach. It's hard work. You get criticized all the time. I think most of us have thick skin by now, so you get used to it. Preparing exams, it's not easy to prepare an exam that is flawless. I mean, I unfortunately remember, everyone, problem 2, that should be a minus sign. It takes. It's not as easy as it looks. How about from the panel? What are some suggestions that the students could take even now to start to develop and hone their skills in teaching? What are some of the things they can do?
Well, there are 2 principles that come to mind off the top of my head. The first one is you have to be crystal clear on what it is that you want from your students. Primarily because when students are confused, they get very, very angry and then they will attack you. So the clearer you can be about what your expectations are, what you are grading on, all of the rubrics that you're using, share them ahead of time so that the students know what you are doing. And that way, you're clear, they're clear, and they're not going to be angry at you. Along with that, what I have found as an educator and a psychologist is you do much better if you start out tough and then ease up. If you start out soft and then try to toughen up, they will hate you. So kill them immediately, and then you can ease back as you're going. But you can't do it the other way around. If you start out soft, you're only going to be able to get softer, and then you're going to get nothing done in your class.
And that goes with grading too. I know many times this is exactly consistent with the grading. I get my Excel spreadsheet, and I might find that, maybe I'll just bump not just one person, but everyone up perhaps a half point because I thought that maybe I didn't teach that right. But you could never bump everyone down. I mean, it'll just be disastrous. So yeah, it's better to be tough. I agree 100%. You can always.
One of the nice things about teaching is it gets easier over time.
Oh, yeah.
All aspects of it get easier. You get used to prepping courses. You get used to the actual teaching exercises. The students respond differently. Unfortunately, as you get older, it's much easier to do things like control large classrooms because the students assume that you know what the hell you're talking about as you get older. And so everything really does get easier. And as a new faculty member, it takes a tremendous amount of time. It takes a lot of time and effort to prep courses and also do all the basic classroom management things which you aren't trained to do necessarily. And so it's a tremendous amount of time.
Also, what I think or I'm hoping is that if you spend the time up front, it pays off in the long run. So I'm just trying to be very organized. You know, I've met people who teach the same class every year, but every year, an hour before class, they're scrambling to like put together notes, and I'm like, you teach this every year, you know? Like, what are you doing? You know?
And
So I
that's
just
a wonderful idea.
Okay,
Just do it
yeah.
once
like
and
I'm
do
just
it
trying
well.
to stay organized, and then another thing is realize if you've been this far in your education and are getting your PhD, you're probably a pretty motivated student. And realize that not everyone is going to be that motivated or be able to spend the time in class that you've had the luxury to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because people have different backgrounds and different abilities. You got to realize that up front and not just expect everyone to, you know, you can have very high expectations. That's good. Some of the, in engineering, we went through the class reviews and some of the hardest classes got the best reviews. But so have high expectations, but realize that people are coming from different perspectives than your own.
Yes, I have a question. How is the school evaluate the performance of your teaching? I know they look at the student survey, but addition to that, do they look at any other indicators?
Oh,
For example, like students readiness for future stuff? Or?
Now here, it's going to differ from every university, so all we can really talk about is what Oakland does. But Oakland looks at the student surveys, they look at evaluation that other faculty have made by watching you teach, which means that you, the teacher, have to invite faculty into your classroom, and then you have to remind them to write a letter. We look at how many courses you've developed, how many courses you have altered or changed or taken through process. We look at your syllabi. We look at letters from students. And if your department is really being thorough, the department will actually solicit information from students separate from the student evaluations that happen at the end of classes.
Pedagogical journals too.
Yep.
So you know, if you like, we talk about publishing, but you could certainly publish on teaching.
Yep.
On how and better methods of teaching, so that would tie into it.
Right, in the School of Medicine, they give twice as much credit for people to publish about improving medical education than they do just, you know, your basic science research.
Now we have one professor, actually there are a couple of professors in engineering, but what about a book? What if the professor wants to write a book? How do you weigh that? Is that equal to...
It's equal
Yep.
to one article.
Well, unfortunately.
So if you want to write a book, get tenure first,
Right.
because it's equal to one article.
Yeah. So I mean, isn't that a shame? So you spend all that time writing a book, a textbook, and I think
There are some areas where it's different. In
Yeah, yeah.
history, you don't have articles that you're publishing books. Political science is kind of straddling the fence, but for the most part, books are counted as one article. It's one publication.
Okay, next slide. Okay, their students want to hear about the importance of the class material, not the importance of the professor. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's easy sometimes to kind of, you know, feel good about yourself, maybe too good about yourself in front of your students, but they pick that up very quickly. I mean, they're really interested. As I said, your goal is to be in the classroom, to educate, to inspire. It's all about, you know, disseminating that information. And I don't really have much more to say about this slide. I just thought it was kind of funny, so that's why I put it there. So we'll go to the next slide. We've covered this. Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered that. It takes a lot of time. So we'll go to the next slide. Professors should not rely only on their opinion of how well they performed in the classroom. So the idea is, you know, it's easy sometimes to think that you're really, really good, you know, but sometimes it is important. This goes to actually the point of, you know, Professor Smith said that other faculty members come into the classroom and critique your work. That's wonderful. You have to be a little humble to do that because, I mean, we have big egos, right? And if you don't have a big ego, you're probably going to have a big ego once you become an assistant professor. But honestly, humility goes a long way. You can learn so much. So this slide just speaks to that. Make sure that you really crave and grow from criticism. It's, that's the way I look at it. When I write papers, you grow from the criticism. Listen carefully to those students. It's when the students are complaining, some of them will complain no matter what. There's no question about that. And you're just going to get that. They'll complain about anything and everything. But a lot of it is very legitimate. And so you just have to be sometimes your best critic. And that's one way to improve.
And one of the things I would suggest with student evaluations would be to look for themes in the evaluations. So occasionally you'll get one student will complain about something completely random. But if you're starting to see the same sorts of things creeping up in student evaluation after student evaluation, then that may be something that you want to really pay attention to in the future.
Don't take that criticism too personally. I can say this because, I've done pretty well in my teaching, but I do remember one remark from one student, this is probably 2002, but he said something to the effect that, before I took the class with Professor Smith, I really thought very highly of professors, but after I took the class with him, I just think very low of professors. They don't know anything. And I've never forgotten that comment. So, but, it is what it is. You're going to get a little bit of everything.
Also, I think don't be afraid to ask before the semester's over how the students think it's going. This is probably the fourth class that I taught, but I always ask halfway through if the students can write down something they like, something they dislike, and something I could personally change to improve the class. But then I also try to address that in the class and say, look at the big picture things. Like, I realized over the summer I taught a course that was mostly sophomores, and I realized I didn't give a very good test review. I'm used to teaching upperclassmen, and they're a little bit more independent when it comes to tests. So I gave a pretty vague review for the test, and these students said, you didn't tell us what was on the test. I thought, well, I can't tell you what is on the test, but you're right. I can do a better review for the test, and I need to realize that, you're underclassmen. Yeah. So, you can get things that you can help tweak, not make huge changes, but tweak things throughout the semester. And if the students see that and see that you're acknowledging it, that'll probably go a long way in your final reviews, that you did something to help them. So.
Next one. Now, this is just my comment. I do. It's certainly not the case in engineering for us, but I think it is very possible, in particular some of the high-profile schools, that you come in with a group of 8 assistant professors, and they will work you like a farm animal, for 6 years, and there are 3 spots for you, but there's 8 of you coming in. And they know that they're only going to fill 3. And you know that they know that. I would not want to personally be in that situation, because what happens is that Megan and I, Dr. Conrad and I are working side by side. She and I are going for the same spot. I'm not sure I really want to help her that much. You know what I mean? It's really, in my opinion, it's very poisonous. And it's not that way in engineering. I don't know how it is in the other departments, but that is a real possibility.
I think, different institutions behave differently. Harvard never gives tenure. When you become an assistant professor at Harvard, you're doing it for the privilege of working at Harvard for a few years. And no one has the expectation that they're going to get tenure at Harvard. It's just not how it works. A lot of the upper institutions behave that way. Michigan hasn't tenured an assistant professor in the School of Education in 17 years. They hire, when they want an associate or a full, they hire at associate or full level out of another university. So the point of being an assistant professor at those institutions is you're working there for the privilege of having that name on your resume when you go to find another job. And you may as well treat it that way. It's like an advanced postdoc. So, if you're aware of it, you can function that way, and you can gain the experience and gain prestige as you move to your next job. Oakland hires assistant professors with an expectation that they'll make tenure. And I think that's the case in every department. So that's a different kind of attitude. When you're hired as an assistant at Oakland, there's a very strong expectation that you will make tenure. And at least in the School of Education, we go out of our way to make sure you will make tenure. Like I send emails to some of our assistant professors 3 or 4 times a week. What have you published this week? What are you sending out? How is your personal statement coming? Send something in right now. So I'm a big harassment person, but the goal is to get tenure.
Sure, absolutely. Question is about.
Well, actually, kind of answered, but would you, aside if it's not a high-profile school, would you be able to ask that question if they're filling just for 3, they're going to just offer 3 positions of tenure, and they're bringing in 8 people? Would you know that during the interview? Would you be able to get that information?
You can ask.
Yeah, I'm not sure you'd get a straight answer. I don't know.
And most places, you'll only get that sort of pressure really at the more high-profile institutions, typically. And so if you're applying for a job at Harvard, you need to walk into that knowing that there's a low probability of you actually getting tenured as an assistant professor at Harvard. Most other institutions, it isn't the case where you have this sort of setup where there are 5 assistant professors and only 3 tenure spots. For example, in the Department of Psychology, there isn't a maximum number of tenured positions. It's simply a matter of once we hire a faculty member, it's a matter of whether or not they make the transition, but it isn't as if we're limited in some way. So it depends a lot on the institution itself.
So this is another thing you can ask assistant professors when you go. Now, let me just back up a second. Do you know what an interview for a professor position is like? Well, you know how sometimes you go in for a job interview and you talk to somebody for about an hour and that's the end of it? That's not how professors get interviewed. An actual interview for a professor position, for example, in the School of Education, takes 2 days. So you come in, the morning of the first day, you'll have breakfast with the committee, and you will talk with the committee about what the interests are. Then you will have a research presentation. Then you will have meetings with various faculty to talk about various kinds of topics. At Oakland, then we have lunch with the faculty. Then we have a teaching demonstration in the afternoon where the person will teach a course or a class to a particular group of people. Then in the next day, you come in and you have a meeting with the dean, and you talk with another round of conversation with the faculty, and you have at Oakland a conversation with the union rep, and it's 2 solid days of conversations with people. Now, at every one of those conversations with professors, you have the chance to ask questions. You need to ask questions. Like, how many of the assistant professors that were hired 5 years ago made tenure?
And the important questions, ask every single person.
Yeah.
You might get 2 different answers, and you'll be able to kind of figure it out.
I have a question. With the volatility of the budget, 6 years foresight of how many positions would be there, how is it feasible in this current?
They wouldn't know how many positions would be available in 6 years. We don't know how many positions will be available in 6 years. So it really depends on the institution. If the institution is hiring assistants with the expectation that they are going to make tenure and continue up in the ranks,